And I am delighted to welcome our 8 panelists for this panel discussion. I will introduce them. They are helpfully sitting in the order in which they are going to speak. And starting from your left and moving right, we have Jo Kirby-Atkinson, Secretary General of IIC. We have Julian Bickersteth, Vice President of IIC. We have Vinod Daniel, representing ICOM Conservation Committee. We have Lynn DeStefano, who's a professor at Hong Kong University on the Architectural Conservation Programme. We have Dr. Song Ji-rong from the Palace Museum in Beijing, who is the Deputy Director of the museum and the Director of the Conservation Department. Thank you. We have Jerry Padani, who is the President Emeritus of IIC. We have Richard Wesley, the Director of the Maritime Museum, and with perfect timing, making his way to the stage, we have Yun Chan Young, who is the director of the Shanxi Provisional Institute of Archaeology. So, welcome to our panelists. The purpose of this session is to discuss the environmental guidelines that we presented on the first day and have been available in paper form all week. And we have had them in both the English and the Mandarin version. So that was one of the critical pieces of information that Julian referred to on Monday. The other information to inform our debate is the special issue of Studies in Conservation that was in your Congress pack. And in that, there are 3 papers by me, Jo, and Julian, just summarizing the state of the nation at this point in time. Jo, Julian, and I will very, very briefly present those papers. We will take them as read as they were in the pack, so it'll be a very, very brief summary of less than 5 minutes. And then I shall invite each of the other panelists to speak also for up to 5 minutes, and then I shall open the discussion to the floor for 35 minutes, and then at the end, I will again invite each member of the panel to respond in less than a minute to what has happened during the discussion. And at the end, I will say what the next steps will be. So, I am going to start by just very briefly summarizing my paper that was in Studies in Conservation on environmental conditions, future trends. And if someone could come and put the presentation on the screen, please. Thank you. In the paper, there were 3 main sections. The first was on the question of research. Is more research into recommended relative humidity levels needed? How much do we know about the relationship between the environment and the material response? And I observed that there was the need to gather together the scientific papers and grey literature in one easily accessible place. There is a lot of literature, but people find it difficult to get hold of it. The Getty Conservation Institute are starting a project called Managing Collections Environment, which may help to address this. we need to identify research gaps and fill them. And then I asked the question, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? And I think that members of the panel may help us with these questions. The first, is it about reducing energy consumption and the carbon footprint of museums, perhaps with the use of renewable energy? Is it about saving money? Is it about enabling international loan exhibitions? Is it about providing principles for determining environmental conditions for collections on permanent display and in storage? And it may be, all of those or just some of them. So again, in the discussion, we may want to come back to those questions. I then have a section about decision-making in museums, and talk about the role of risk management, about perhaps the need to move away from the precautionary principle, which we have used for many years by saying if it's possible to create very tight environmental conditions, then we should do it, because that's being the safest we can be, but it may not be justified when you do a cost-benefit analysis. I talk about multidisciplinary working, so it's not just the conservators and the conservation scientists, but it's all the museum professionals, and it's very good to have representatives from archaeology, from museum directors, from conservation, architectural conservation, as well as conservator experts on the panel. And I also talk about cultural leadership and having a more varied professions involved in the leadership of museums and cultural heritage organizations. And so thinking about conservators and conservation scientists and other conservation professionals aspiring to reach the levels of directorship. And I end by talking about IIC's role with this, and firstly, it's been enabling the debate with ICOM-CC, and Jerry and Julian have led on that for IIC, and Vinod and Lisa Pelosi, who is she has just finished as chair of the directory board of ICOM-CC, have been talking about this for the last 3 years. IIC may also help to facilitate the advancement of conservation professionals into leadership positions in museums and cultural organizations. IIC fellows will be meeting at lunchtime today. May I take this opportunity to remind you that we're doing this, and this may be one of the subjects, this will be one of the subjects that we will be discussing. And finally, I note that IIC's role is as much about caring for the future as it is for the past. Thank you. Now Jo will talk.
I'm not actually going to go into, thank you very much indeed. Great. It has happened. Right. I'm not going to go very much into the details of the background. There is a very long and detailed article with a great deal of reading matter in the studies in conservation that's in your pack. However, I would like to say something about this book, which is the starting point for very much of the discussion that we've been having worldwide in for the last few years, and certainly at this period. I want to emphasize what he didn't say, really. Gary Thompson looked at the behavior of different materials as far as this was known, and he made suggestions, as we see here, for a set point of about 50 to 55% relative humidity and a temperature of about 20 degrees centigrade, depending on the class of building. And he suggested values for other climatic conditions. What he did not say was that these conditions were necessarily good for every sort of climate and every sort of building. And I think this is actually quite important because this, of course, leads on to the, several of the questions that have arisen already this morning. And obviously, a long-established collection may actually have become quite acclimatized to its own local climate, and if we then try and impose these conditions, this is not necessarily a very good idea. We find that these values are requested from architects and engineers and applied very much more widely than he envisaged. And they're also requested for loans, and of course they're not necessarily appropriate for the objects that are requested. There have been some recent events, of course, discussing what constitutes a stable climate for investigation and storage of different classes of object. And this has drawn attention to the generally accepted need to reduce carbon emissions and to consider the effects of climate change on cultural heritage objects. And these have included the dialogue on climate change and museum collections that we held at the IIC London conference in 2008, and its successor held at the AIC meeting in 2010. And there have been some other very interesting conferences, such as the Museum Microclimates Congress, which was held in Copenhagen in 2007, and of course the recent Climate for Collections one held in Munich in 2012. And in this collection, all these are based on a very large historical background of work on the buildings and the science. And in this respect, I'd like to draw your attention actually to a book that hasn't been mentioned. That's Sarah's recent book on historical perspectives on preventive conservation, which was published last year, because this encloses extracts from some of the most significant literature, and some of this literature is indeed very hard to find. This slide summarizes some of the earlier work that was done to control the internal environments of museums. For example, the 1890s in Munich and 1908 in Boston. But in Boston, for example, while they suggest a set point of 55 to 60% RH, they make the point they found this was suitable for paintings, but they already know that it's no good for armor because this corrodes unless you give it a wax finish. Various other, what is suitable for the National Gallery paintings is not necessarily suitable for everything else. And of course, the historical study of the paintings of the National Gallery and the Manod slate quarries, which took place over the war when they had to be moved out of London to save them from the wartime air raids. This is a very well-known study, and it draws attention to the fact that the stable conditions in the cave stopped the flaking of the paint and the cracking of the wood that was already being observed regularly in the gallery rooms that were not then air-conditioned. They were not air-conditioned until after the war, as a result of the stable conditions that took place during the war. In the 1960s, as we see that they were generally, around the world, you find these average values of about 50 to 60%. But of course, they weren't always achievable or satisfactory in cold climates. And various other solutions were tried by the 1990s. I would draw attention, for example, to the conservation heating used by the National Trust in England. And one of the reasons for this was the need for historic buildings where, firstly, you couldn't necessarily install the air conditioning, and secondly, these conditions were not necessarily achievable, and there has been a great deal of discussion in more recent years. Now, the scientific background to all this work on air conditioning and heating and ventilation, which studies of the materials and themselves and their behavior, this all goes back to a series of studies carried out in the 1990s and so on. And they found that for most materials, relative humidity was more significant than temperature, except for chemical degradation. And this work led to the recently suggested broader values, which we're going to hear discussed later in the ASHRAE handbook. But there are snags here, because it doesn't take account of, model studies don't take account of the unpredictability of the response of real objects, which are very much more composite and complex, and they may have been repaired with a variety of materials. And of course, the climatic conditions under which they've been kept in the past is probably not known. But there is more useful research beginning to appear both on modelling and on real cultural heritage objects, and I think that is going to be particularly valuable.
My task is to report on the joint survey which was set up between ISC and ICON-CC, seeing common interest in this issue, in terms of a survey which we've been running for about the last 18 months, and we've got some good interim results, which will come up in a moment. That survey had ultimately three components to it. One is to gather information from around the world. Secondly, to allow us to, in a sense, reassess, reapproach where we are with all this information. And three, to dialogue more broadly, not only amongst ourselves, but particularly to dialogue in terms of with our profession as well.
Sorry.
Is it coming up?
Sorry.
No, next one down. All right. So here are the three components of the tasks that the working group was given to provide this report, to identify methodology and to dialogue with the broader museum profession. So let me tell you what's come up from that. Firstly, no country has a national position on environmental guidelines for its museums. The closest one gets to such are made by bodies such as the VDR in Germany and the AIC in the US. But even in the UK, where PAS 198 is the precursor to a new British standard, the closest position it could be assumed to be of a national position, the custodians of the National Art Collection, the National Gallery London, are on the face of it not in agreement. What the survey has therefore provided, is mostly information on the position being taken on environmental standards in the principal museums of that country. While this information could be called the national position, inevitably smaller institutions look to their national counterparts for advice on such matters, and also borrow collections from them under loan conditions, both of which dictate the environmental conditions that they seek to provide. Thus, respondents in Finland and Denmark note that environmental standards of their national institutions reflect the prevalent national view. The reality, however, is also that many smaller institutions are struggling to provide any form of environmental control, let alone a carefully controlled one. Secondly, the social responsibility of reducing non-renewable energy consumption and creating a sustainable future as the driver for the debate on environmental standards is acknowledged. Those conservators who feel it is unsafe to broaden environmental standards directly address alternative ways in which the carbon footprint of museums can be reduced. The survey indicates that we as conservators, as a profession, are very aware of our social responsibilities on this front. Thirdly, although the set points for temperature and RH are varies between climate zones, there is no obvious disagreement from respondents on what is the optimum environment for the safe display and storage of collections in terms of minimization of fluctuations. Some respondents, however, appear to be more pragmatic than others as to what in reality is being achieved. Seasonal adjustment is widely used, with the process prevalent in countries where there is a major change in climate between winter and summer, e.g. Finland and Spain. Fourthly, underlying many of the responses is frustration around the international loan process. The VDR response to the BISO Group's interim guidelines is the most obvious articulation of one aspect of this frustration, with German conservators not liking being told by non-conservators what are safe conditions for collection display, especially when they sense there is a hidden agenda around increasing the volume of art loans. Another aspect of conservator frustration is with each other, namely the unrealistic requirements on loan conditions being demanded by the registrars and conservators of loaning institutions, which often bear little relation to the actual conditions the loan item is normally stored or displayed in. Fifthly, in its simplest form, this debate is about whether the risks in broadening the environmental parameters for objects currently displayed or stored in tightly controlled environments can be safely managed. It's not about the merits of passive environmental control or the undeniable fact that many current collections have safely existed in museums and houses around the world for centuries with no or minimal climate control. The principal Portuguese conservation publication on this issue specifically states that climate conditions should not be changed where collections seem stable, citing examples of stable organic collections consistently living under 40% RH or over 80% RH. It is a debate, therefore, that is limited to those professional conservators who deal on a regular basis with collections held in climate-controlled environments. But there's also the perception that damage to artworks is more irreversible than to objects, artworks rather than objects. A comment was made, it seems that museum conservators may be more tolerant of the idea of proof fluctuations and an unavoidable percentage of damage accepted, as against art gallery conservators who tend more vehemently not to accept this premise. It's also a debate about protecting one's own collection as it is about taking a broader view. As already identified, conservators, us as a profession, appear to be a socially responsible group caring deeply about environmental sustainability. However, when faced with making decisions that directly impact on the collections for which we're responsible, conservators tend to be conservative and err on the side of caution in the absence of definitive scientific proof to convince them the risks are minimal. The National Gallery in London, I've already mentioned, has already said that they're empowered by the UK government not only to look after the national art collection, but also act as the leading expert national advisor on the care of old master paintings. It's from this perspective that they provide their recommended environmental parameters, whilst also stating that if convincing and reliable evidence emerged that environmental standards could be relaxed safely under a lower energy regime, we would of course take advantage of that evidence in our practice and in our recommendations to others. In turn, this also colours the loan conditions placed on artworks, with some loaning bodies actively placing tighter conditions on loans than the artworks are normally held in, so as to try and minimise any risk during the loan. Conversely, conservators that are not reporting from a perspective of direct care tend to take a more relaxed view. The CCI, for instance, says, our approach to climate control here at CCI is a pragmatic one that is tailored to specific contexts, collections and regions. Second last, the ASHRAE table seems to be the most common point of a reference point, along with Gary Thompson's Museum Environment and the CCI publications. And finally, the science around the effects of broadened environmental parameters is widely raised as being inconclusive and too based on experimental rather than experiential data. Alongside this, questions are raised about the cost-benefit of energy savings resulting from the widening of environmental parameters, as against potential savings from other sources, such as the use of combined heat and power plants and by installing LED lights. So I think I'll leave it there, but please do refer in more detail to the survey results in the studies edition in your folders. Thank you, Sarah.
First of all, thanks Sarah, Xingwei, IIC colleagues for this opportunity to be here. And I think it's more than a coincidence that as we are progressing towards putting a document together, I think the first round of discussions we had in Melbourne, much more cooler, probably a bit more drier conditions, and we are progressing, the next location is Hong Kong, where a lot more humid, a lot more warmer. So I think it's great. I mean, it provides the right setting. From ICOM CC's perspective, I think it's great. This collaboration is fantastic, and it's something ICOM CC is very committed to. I work quite a bit in the region, especially the Asia-Pacific region, and I've seen pretty interesting examples on how people cope with certain climatic conditions. I mean, I've been to a museum in a very hot tropical location. Peak summer, the security guard was shivering. He had opened a window so that he could stand next to the window and feel a bit warm. I went to one museum where the director was panicking because 25% of their budget was just spent on energy costs. ICOM, as a broader organization, has probably got members from every country in the globe. And we keep getting requests coming directly from ICOM in Paris saying, look, there's an inquiry on what they should do with regard to this particular issue. And we never had an easy answer. We always would refer them to some guideline or the other. Same with ICOM CC, it represents about 3,000 members. There's been quite a lot of discussions happening probably over the last 2 decades. So in many ways, I'm glad that we are progressing on that. And I think the approach we are probably taking is like a Chinese fishing net. Make it as broad as possible to start with. And eventually, I think with consensus, we'll narrow down and probably come to an agreed solution. And we are still talking in terms of broader principles. So what I'll do at this stage very much is just to table the recommendations that came out of the Melbourne meeting. Again, we had a small panel discussions out there in Melbourne. And our interest is very much to keep building on that. It's not that we'll find a solution in this conference, but maybe over the next 2 or 3 years, we'll slowly progress towards getting a good consensus. I'm not sure whether all of you have got a copy of that. Yep, that's great. So I'll just quickly read through that. At the ICOM CC conference in Melbourne in September 2014, the delegates discussed and agreed the following draft declaration. The conservation profession has come together and agreed a position on environmental guidelines as follows. The issue of museum sustainability is much broader than the discussion on environmental standards and needs to be a key underlying criterion of future principles. Museums and collecting institutions should seek to reduce their carbon footprint and environmental impact to mitigate climate change by reducing their energy use and examining alternative renewable energy sources. Noting that most museums in the world have no climate control system in their exhibition and storage spaces, we acknowledge the need for a document that will influence decision makers that the environmental conditions for international loans may not be appropriate for the permanent display and storage of collections in all museums. There needs to be flexibility in the provision of environmental conditions for loans from museums which have climatic conditions different from the set points in the guidelines. This may be achieved with alternative strategies such as microclimates. The existing interim guidelines agreed by AIC, AICCM, the Bizot Group, etc., should be guidelines, not interim guidelines. It is noted that these guidelines are intended for international loan exhibitions. There needs to be transparency about actual environmental conditions achieved in museums to ensure that realistic requirements are made for loan conditions. Guidelines for environmental conditions for permanent display and storage should be achievable for the local climate. Care of collection should be achieved in a way that does not assume air conditioning. Passive methods, simple technology that's easy to maintain, and lower energy solutions should be considered. Risk management should be embedded in museum management processes. It is acknowledged that the issue of collection and material environmental requirements is complex, and conservators, conservation scientists should actively seek to explain and unpack these complexities. And then at the end, we got the 3 guidelines which I had mentioned there, which is attached. Thank you very much.